Get ready, history lovers, because today I'm going to give you my personal ranking of the Tudor monarchs, from worst to best. There are 5 to get through, and they are, in chronological order, Henry VII, Henry VIII, Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I. No Lady Jane Grey, I'm afraid, as she wasn't actually a Tudor, and I don't see her as a genuine monarch either. I'll be discussing how hard they had to work to get and keep the throne, how they treated their subjects and sometimes their family members while they were there, and any mitigating factors which might explain their bad behaviour. Events discussed will include the end of the Wars of the Roses, the 6 wives of Henry VIII, Edward VI's experience of being a child monarch, Mary I's habit of burning Protestants at the stake, and Elizabeth I's refusal to marry. I'm sure there will be cries of treason in the comments from people who disagree with the order I put them in, but this is all just for fun, remember, and you can tell me your rankings down there as well. Let's get into it. Okay, starting with my least favourite Tudor, who comes in at number 5 on our list. It is, drumroll, Henry VIII, who reigned from 1509 to 1547. Why do I dislike him the most out of all the Tudors? It's not like England was successfully invaded on his watch. The Scots did try, but his first wife Catherine of Aragon sent an army to flatten them, and the first 20 years or so of his reign were pretty successful. Well, of course, it comes down to what happened from the 1530s on. Henry dumped Catherine because she couldn't provide him with a son, and embarked on a very checkered marital career which involved wedding 5 more women: Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr. We might say that Henry was right to aggressively pursue a legitimate son, given that he was still only the 2nd monarch of his dynasty, and the previous dynasty, the Plantagenets, had suffered decades of upheaval due to the Wars of the Roses and the frequent lack of a strong king with an undisputed male heir. In an era before there had ever been a successful female ruler of post-conquest England, Henry needed a boy to pass the throne on to in order to help ensure the stability of the realm and prevent a slide back into civil war. Personally, though, I think he was too aggressive in his actions, and not all of them were in pursuit of a son. Of his 6 wives, he had 2, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, executed, with Anne in particular being killed on trumped-up charges because she too hadn't produced a living son, and he nearly had Catherine Parr arrested as well. He was often a lousy husband too, even before he killed or dumped his wives. He cheated on several of them, and probably would have cheated on the others too if he'd had the time and or been physically able to do so. Finally, he threw over loyal servants such as Thomas Wolsey and Thomas Cromwell when they couldn't make his marital dreams come true, showing a shocking lack of loyalty, empathy, or even gratefulness for all they'd done for him, and an unwillingness to act like a grown-up and take responsibility for his own messes. His parenting skills left a lot to be desired too. We'll come back to his mistreatment of his eldest daughter, Mary, in a few minutes, but suffice to say he put her through the ringer when she was a teenager because she sided with her mother, Catherine of Aragon, during her parents' split, and refused to acknowledge that she was illegitimate, as Henry tried to force her to do. He was also neglectful of Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, in the aftermath of the fall of her mother, forgetting to even have new clothes sent to her as she outgrew her old ones. We should acknowledge that he was fond of his 2 boys though, Edward VI, son of Jane Seymour, and his illegitimate son Henry Fitzroy, but no one likes a parent who so obviously plays favourites, unless you happen to be the favourite, I suppose. Then we have the infamous break from the church in Rome, which he did in order to get his first marriage annulled, setting himself up as the head of the church in England instead. His insistence that his people swear allegiance to him over the Pope tore the country apart, and led to the executions of men like his former favourite Thomas More, because their consciences wouldn't allow them to do as Henry demanded. The king was also motivated by greed, as well as his desire for Anne Boleyn, and wanted to get the church's money and lands for himself and his cronies. Through it all, though, Henry remained a Catholic at heart, even as he had what I'm going to call proto-Protestantism, because it wasn't yet what we'd now call Anglicanism, introduced into his country, and his younger two children raised in the new religion. And on the whole, it must be said that the Reformation was really poorly thought out, if we could call it thought out at all. Henry didn't seem to think about the damage to the fabric of society that this rapid and enforced religious change and the dissolution of the monasteries and nunneries all across the country would cause, but it was chaotic and led to the Counter-Reformation, which was especially violent in England during his daughter Mary's reign. Speaking of Mary, she sits at the number 4 position in my rankings. Reigning between 1553 and 1558, she was England's first Queen Regnant who was able to hang on to her throne, and she came to power on a wave of popularity, after her half-brother Edward VI tried to oust her in favour of their Protestant cousin Lady Jane Grey. In just 5 short years, though, she had completely squandered most of this good feeling, and when she died, she was mourned by relatively few. As fervent a Catholic as Edward had been a Protestant, she was determined to reverse the introduction of the new religion into England, which had begun during her father's reign and continued during her brother's, and as a result, her reign was marred by the burnings of around 300 Protestants who wouldn't convert. She also had the teenage Lady Jane Grey and her husband Lord Guilford Dudley executed, despite the fact that they had really been no more than puppets in the attempted coups against Mary. Other issues which destroyed her popularity were her very unpopular marriage to her cousin, King Philip of Spain, the loss of Calais, which had been England's last foothold in France on her watch, and 2 pseudo-pregnancies, though these issues are much less Mary's fault than the brutalities of the Counter-Reformation. There are some mitigating factors to help explain her behaviour, though. As I've already mentioned, Mary had a terrible later childhood, thanks to the atrocious behaviour her father meted out to her. She was banned from seeing her mother. Catherine ultimately died, with Mary not having seen her for years. She was stripped of her title of princess, declared illegitimate, and sent to wait on her new little half-sister, Princess Elizabeth. She was threatened with violence for not bending to her father's will, hardly even given enough clothing to wear, and lived in fear of being killed on Henry or Anne Boleyn's orders. It must have done untold damage to her psyche, and it's one of the reasons she held on so tightly to her faith and was so determined to undo her father's reformation. Although Henry did eventually place her back into the line of succession, he did so without re-legitimising her. And when he died and her 9-year-old brother Edward VI came to the throne, Mary found herself under increasing pressure to convert to Protestantism, so much so that she almost fled the country. Funnily enough, though, a few years later, and despite the obvious similarities in their predicaments, she demonstrated remarkably little sympathy for Elizabeth when the latter seemed unwilling to convert to Catholicism during Mary's reign. When Edward tried and failed to cut her out of the succession, and she finally got the throne after decades of having to fight for it, she must have thought that it was God's will, and she was there to undo the religious changes of her father and brother. This doesn't excuse her behaviour on the throne, but it can help us to understand how she reached that point. During the hard years of Henry and Edward's reigns, it had also been her mother's powerful Spanish family whose interventions on her behalf had likely prevented her from being treated even worse, though they didn't always come through for her, it must be said. And this explains her determination to marry a Spanish cousin. Her pseudo-pregnancies show her desperation to become a mother and secure the English throne for her dynasty, not unlike the desperation her father and brother had once shown. And if you only read Mary's biographies up to 1553, plus a few details from her final 5 years, I think you'd actually feel incredibly sorry for her. This is why she's at number 4 and not right at the bottom of the list. I think there are better explanations for her bad behaviour than there are for her father's, who never suffered in the ways that she did. At number 3, we have that pesky little brother, Edward VI. Edward came to the throne in 1547, as I've said, at the age of 9, and ruled until 1553, when he died at the age of 15. As he was a minor throughout his time on the throne, he had a Lord Protector to rule the country on his behalf, though towards the end of his life he was taking more control. The first Protector was his maternal uncle Edward Seymour. He fell from favour, however, as did his brother Thomas Seymour, and both were executed with very little grief, it must be said, shown on Edward's part. The king was raised as a strict Protestant, and as I've already mentioned, he wanted his Catholic sister Mary, who was the heiress presumptive throughout his reign, to convert to that religion, and had some almighty rows with her when she wouldn't do it. Edward, it must be said, looks like he was well on his way to becoming a total tyrant, which is always one of the risks of someone having absolute power given to them as youngsters without ever having to earn it, and had he reigned longer, perhaps I'd have ranked him lower. He died before this could happen though, and so we have to judge him only on what actually did happen and not on what might have been. His youth and the fact that he wasn't really in control of his life or his country means that I don't think we can blame this boy for most of the errors of his kingship. There is one though which I do put at his feet, and that is his attempt in his final illness to alter the succession and leave the throne to Lady Jane Grey. This went against his father's will, which was underpinned by an Act of Parliament, and it could have caused a full-blown civil war if Jane had had stronger support around the country. As it was, it put Jane in Mary's firing line and ultimately led to the girl's death the following year. In the runner-up position, we have Henry VII. This Henry is often overshadowed by his famous mother, Lady Margaret Beaufort, his son Henry VIII, and his granddaughter Elizabeth I. But I've always thought that he has one of the most fascinating stories of any king of England, and his life up to the point he took the throne was the basis for the character of Daenerys Targaryen in Game of Thrones. Born in Wales in 1457 as the Earl of Richmond, he was the half-nephew of Henry VI and had no real claim on the throne, for he descended from Edward III through an originally illegitimate line. His half-uncle was deposed when he was still a child, and little Henry was stripped of his title and lands, taken from Lady Margaret, and given to the supporters of the new king, Edward IV, to be raised by them. Eventually, his support for Henry VI ended up forcing him to spend 14 years in exile in modern-day France, starting in 1471, and dodging assassins sent by Edward IV and his brother Richard III. I'm not going to explain it all here, as that's a whole video in itself, but if you see my videos on Henry VII and his mother, they explain the situation to you. They're in the Tudor Monarchs playlist and the Wars of the Roses playlist, which I've left linked in the description box below for you. When Henry did finally take the throne, it was only after a fight to the death against Richard III and his forces at the Battle of Bosworth in August 1485, and I've always admired Henry's bravery and willingness to put himself in harm's way to get the crown. And yes, though I'm not a great fan of Richard III, I admire his bravery in going onto the battlefield to try to retain his throne too. Henry's bravery had to be displayed again as he spent the next 14 years fending off pretenders to his throne, and more than any other Tudor, he literally had to fight to get and keep the crown. He has a reputation for being very grasping and stingy, and this is true, but bear in mind where he had come from. This was a little boy who'd had everything taken from him, and who probably didn't even have very many clothes to his name at the time he came to the throne, having spent his entire adult life up to that point on the run and either a guest or a prisoner in someone else's lands. He was a guy who probably never really relaxed, because from the time he was a child, someone was pretty much always trying to kill him. Even allies, such as his step-uncle, Sir William Stanley, turned against him. So while he could be ruthless when he had to be, and had those who betrayed him executed, including Stanley, I've never seen in him the kind of bloodthirsty love of destruction that I see in his son and his grandchildren, Edward VI and Mary I. He allowed his wife's cousin, the Earl of Warwick, to live for 14 years after he took the throne, albeit in prison, though the boy was a rival for it, and only killed him and one of the pretenders, named Perkin Warbeck, after they continued to plot against him. He allowed another pretender named Lambert Simnel to come and work in the royal kitchens and ultimately build a comfortable life for himself as a falconer. Could you ever imagine Henry VIII being that lenient? Henry VII married Elizabeth of York, the daughter of his old rival Edward IV, and had 7 children with her. He made serious efforts to get strong allies for England, or at least neutralise its enemies, by marrying his eldest son, Prince Arthur, to the Spanish princess Catherine of Aragon, and his eldest daughter Margaret to the King of Scotland. Sadly, Arthur died soon after his wedding, and only 3 of Henry's children outlived him, while Elizabeth tragically died from childbirth complications, producing their last baby. If the king seemed like a bitter control freak during his reign, and especially towards the end, I can therefore see why his personality turned out like that. He'd had to fight for everything his whole life, and he'd lost a great deal and been betrayed a number of times along the way. On the whole, though, I think that for the time period in which he lived, he was actually a pretty good, restrained monarch who was cautious in his actions and a hard worker. Before we get to number 1, if you're enjoying this content, please give the video a thumbs up, as that really helps it with YouTube, and subscribe to the channel with the notification bell switched on so that you get a little ding every time I upload. You can also find me on Patreon, where I provide bonus material, including early access to ad-free videos, mini podcasts, blog posts, and more. Finally, I have an Amazon storefront where I've gathered together recommendations for history-themed books, TV shows, movies, and other items. Both are linked in the description box below for you, as is my Instagram account. Thank you too to those of you who donate to the channel using the thanks button underneath videos, as your generosity is greatly appreciated. That brings us to number 1. And I'm sure you've already worked out who holds that position. It is, of course, Gloriana herself, Elizabeth I. Born in 1533 to Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth's mother was executed when the girl was 2, and Elizabeth was declared illegitimate and lost her title of princess. Her father eventually placed her back into the line of succession after her brother and sister, but it looked unlikely that she would ever get to the throne. Elizabeth proved to be a very wily customer early on in life. After a scandalous association, shall we say, with her stepfather, Thomas Seymour, who married her final stepmother, Catherine Parr, after Henry VIII's death, Seymour was executed, and the 15-year-old Elizabeth had to talk herself out of any further trouble. Again, I have videos on her life which go into all of this in much more detail if you see my Tudor Monarchs playlist. As the Protestant heiress presumptive during the reign of her Catholic sister Mary, Elizabeth was put under great pressure to convert, and even came close to death at the hands of her sibling when she was locked up in the Tower of London after Mary suspected her of plotting to take the crown. Again, though, Elizabeth kept her wits about her and managed to avoid the headsman. When Mary died in 1558, she came to the throne unopposed at the age of 25. Having witnessed the upheavals of her father and siblings' reigns and experienced what it was like to be pressurized to change her own religion, Elizabeth sought to tread a less extreme path in this area than her brother and sister. She oversaw the formation of the Anglican Church, with herself as its supreme governor, but although she can hardly be said to have been an advocate for religious freedom and toleration, she also didn't go in for mass burnings of those who disagreed with her, and said that she didn't want to make windows into men's souls. Her religious settlement, though by no means perfect, was an improvement on the back and forth that had occurred during the previous 3 reigns, and the length of her reign, which lasted until 1603, gave it time to become embedded. Elizabeth famously never married, and this was both a positive and a negative. A refusal to commit allowed her to dangle the prospect of her hand in front of foreign powers, and was a useful foreign policy tool to help keep them from attacking England. On the other hand, it led to serious concerns about the succession, and when Elizabeth was ill with smallpox when she was 29, it could have been chaos if she died. We could therefore argue that her refusal to even try to extend the Tudor dynasty was reckless. In the end, though, the fact that she had no children allowed the crowns of Scotland and England/Wales to be united under James VI/James I, which mostly stopped the two countries attacking each other. Elizabeth didn't know that option would be available, though, when she was still of childbearing age, so I don't think we can credit her with great foresight here. She ran the risk of leaving her realm in a real mess with her death. The question as to why she refused to wed has never been entirely cleared up, but she told Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, the one man she probably did love, that she would never marry, even when they were still just children. I suppose she'd seen how marriage worked out for all of her father's wives and her sister, while her own early brush with Thomas Seymour may well have given her an early aversion to ever being under the thumb of a man again. She was mistress of herself and of her entire country, and clearly determined not to share with anyone else. Not marrying also meant that she never ran the risk of death in childbirth, something which killed two of her stepmothers and her paternal grandmother. Other parts of her reign were also controversial, yet in the end successful. She supported privateers, we'd likely say pirates, like Sir Francis Drake, despite their criminal behaviour. This was immoral, but financially beneficial to her realm, and it set England on the path towards becoming a global superpower. She kept Mary, Queen of Scots, her great rival, imprisoned for 19 years before having her executed, only to immediately say she hadn't meant to do any such thing. This neutralised the threat from Mary, sure, and made Mary's Protestant son, James, a good potential heir, but it was also a contributing factor in Philip of Spain's decision to launch the Spanish Armada. That Armada, though, led to one of Elizabeth's greatest moments, as she is remembered for giving an epic speech at Tilbury and for her seamen's defeat of the would-be invaders. She knew how to manipulate a situation to her advantage, and I mostly admire that. In terms of her personality, she was vain, but she turned this failing to her advantage as well by becoming an expert at manipulating and controlling her own image. She refused to be seen aging in her portraits and managed to create the cult of Gloriana, an excellent piece of PR that inspired great love for and devotion to her, and which has lasted to this day in many of the history books. She also had a vile temper and could curse with the best of them, but while she was known to banish those who had upset her from court, and she even did this to Leicester on occasion, she very rarely took their heads, unlike her father. She did so with Leicester's stepson, the Earl of Essex, but he was a spoilt brat who practically went into revolt against her, and just like with Mary, Queen of Scots, she still hated having to have him killed. Basically, she had more loyalty than many of her family members, though that's not to say she couldn't be extremely unsentimental when she had to be. She never bothered having her mother's reputation restored or her remains moved to a more salubrious tomb, as drawing attention to her own illegitimacy and the scandal of Anne's fall would have been of no use to her. So in the end, she's my favourite because I admire her intelligence and her ability over the course of a lifetime to balance on the knife edge of being loved but also feared, and of being strong and even ruthless but not a tyrant like her father. What nudges her ahead of her grandfather for me is partly that she did all this as a woman in a man's world, and partly that she managed to maintain a better reputation than him. I don't think he had her eye for PR. Of course, she never had to go into battle herself, so she certainly had advantages over him. So that's how I would rank the Tudor monarchs. I'm curious to hear your thoughts, though. In what order would you put them from worst to best? Let me know in the comments below, and you can also vote for your favourite in the poll now open on my community tab. For more on this infamous family, try one of these options next. And until next time, keep learning.